cure the problem, but innovation can cure the problem, and I think that's what we're striving for. So with that, turn it over to Senator Padilla.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
You're now the chair.
Thank you myself. So proud that California remains committed to leading the nation in the innovation that Senator Manchin just spoke of, and working to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. As part of that broad portfolio, there's currently 11 geologic carbon sequestration proposals in California undergoing review for a Class 6 underground injection control permits at EPA. I'm also pleased to hear that the administration is carefully considering environmental justice concerns when reviewing these projects and applications. While these technologies have the potential to address disproportionate rates of illness experienced by vulnerable communities due to air pollution, we're mindful enough that we recognize it's vital that these new technologies do not inadvertently harm communities in other ways, including through harmful contamination of groundwater basins that provide drinking water to communities. Question for Mr. Piggott. You mentioned in your testimony that the EPA has a responsibility to ensure that carbon capture and storage technologies do not contaminate drinking water. Can you elaborate for a minute on how specifically the EPA is planning to ensure these projects do not have those adverse impacts?
Thank you, Senator Padilla. Yes, I can. I know that the geological formations in the ground are very important for us to consider as we look to ensure that we put these carbon wells in the right places. We examine the geology to ensure that the area is free of fractures and faults. We look at the injected CO2 plume. Where's it expected to go, and what is the likelihood that it could spread? And then we look at the specifics of the well construction itself to ensure that the well is constructed in such a way as to operate properly. But it doesn't stop there, and it doesn't stop with just the issuance of a permit. Long after a well is closed, we ensure that there are requirements in the permits for the permittees to monitor and to put in place and have financial insurance in place, corrective action plans in the event that something unexpected happens. So there are several technical aspects that we embed within our approval of our permits. In addition to that, our job being to secure that people are fully protected from adverse environmental consequences, have taken several steps over this past year to ensure that communities are involved and aware of that process. These common sense practices set out clear expectations for communities and for the project proponents so that everybody knows what the expectations are. So there's a thorough analysis of where these wells are sited, but there's a thorough participation by the communities to ensure everyone's aware and assured of the functional ability of these projects, Senator.
Yeah, well, I'm pleased to hear about the consideration, not just during the application and approval process, but ongoing. It's a very different type of facility, but you're speaking to a senator who lives in the shadow of the Aliso Canyon gas storage facility in Southern California, which was a source of the largest methane gas leak, I believe, in our nation's history just a couple of years ago due to its aging and not sufficiently maintained, obviously, wells and other infrastructure. On a different topic, I know 45Q has been discussed a good amount earlier in the hearing, but I have a question with a slightly different angle to it. In 2020, the International Energy Agency published a report examining the role for carbon capture in the clean energy transition, noting that it would be virtually impossible to reach net zero without carbon capture utilization and sequestration and direct air capture technology. Now, some innovators in California and around the country are going even further and making products like cement with lower or even zero emissions. However, the 45Q tax credit only applies to companies that emit and then capture their emissions, but not companies that are directly lowering or eliminating emissions altogether. Questions for Mr. Crabtree. How should we think about balancing current incentives for carbon capture versus rewarding innovation or innovative technologies for low or reduced emissions?
Thank you, Senator. So, You've identified, obviously, what needs to be a top priority, which is if you can avoid the emissions in the first place, then you should do that. And so I would note that outside the context of carbon management, fortunately, the infrastructure bill is comprehensive, as are the tax credits in the Inflation Reduction Act. So you mentioned the 45Q tax credit, but there's like 48C tax credit. There are other tax credits that are focused on decarbonization as well as funding provisions in the infrastructure bill. One I would note that gets to, I think, your concern is being implemented by the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations, and that's the industrial decarbonization provision. It's a $6 billion provision in the infrastructure bill, and it allows for carbon capture, but it also funds things like advanced energy efficiency in industrial settings, electrifying different heating processes. One of the major demands of energy and sources of emissions in the industrial sector is heat. And so to the extent that we can electrify that heat, we're obviously avoiding emissions, assuming the electricity is decarbonized. And then there's just a range of, the role of hydrogen is also can be brought into industry to avoid emissions in the first place. So that's I think, a critical area where we can make progress and avoid emissions in the first place.
Ms. Burns, would you have anything else to add?
Thank you, Senator. I would say what Brad said on we need to reduce where we can reduce is incredibly important. And I would say also, you touched on the role of California. I will say Carbon 180 started out of California. We were proudly headquartered there until very recently. We're also part of one of the direct air capture hubs projects, the Community Alliance for Direct Air Capture in the Central Valley. And I think we're particularly excited about the role that California has played in leading the nation on things like direct air capture, including the plant that's going to be unveiled next week in Tracy, California, led by Heirloom. And so I think looking holistically at the innovation that we can support in the state and across the country is really essential.
Thank you. Well, flattery will get you very far.
Wonderful.
And just a final note before recognizing Senator Cassidy, I think the longer-term question here is, as new technologies come, want to make sure that we're keeping up with our incentive structure that reflects new technologies that will not necessarily always fit into the categories as we've structured them initially. Senator Cassidy.
Thank you. Mr. Pico,